He massacred so many Native Americans, he was given the nickname Town Destroyer. He relentlessly pursued a slave that managed to escape his grasp. If you disobeyed him while under his military command, he would have you whipped or hanged from the gallows. Who could this monster be? Here's a hint. He's on every $1 bill. George Washington is without a doubt one of the most famous men in American history. Without him, there wouldn't be American history, at least not as we know it. Today, we're digging up the roots of the United States of America and taking a look at the ugly truth about George Washington. If you've ever heard anything about George Washington, chances are you've heard the story about a young George chopping down a cherry tree. When confronted by his father over what he had done, George supposedly responded, "I cannot tell a lie," and confessed. This story has been told again and again to illustrate the honesty and integrity of the young man who would become the first president of the United States. There is just one problem with the story: it never happened. Yes, ironically enough, a story about the value of honesty was a complete fabrication. Who's responsible for the myth? A biographer of Washington, a traveling minister and bookseller named Mason Locke Weems. His book, The Life of Washington, was published in 1800, but the cherry tree story was added to the book's 5th edition in 1806. It's uncertain where Weems came up with this particular story, but the unverified claim caught on and was published in textbooks starting in the 1830s. The rest, as they say, is history. But it isn't George Washington's fault that a biographer made up stories about him after his death. Let's move on to some of the faults he was actually responsible for. Washington is remembered as a great general and a military hero, but in fact he lost more battles than he ever won. He did find success as both a general and a spy master, of course, largely due to the kind of unshakable confidence that some would consider bordering on delusion. But he also saw his fair share of defeats and made a great deal of mistakes. One of the most notable at the beginning of his military career sparked a global war. At age 22, Washington saw battle for the first time during the French and Indian War. He led the British forces in Pennsylvania in May of 1754 alongside a seasoned Mingo warrior. They attacked the encampment of French ensign Joseph Coulon de Jumonville, and according to a Mingo eyewitness, Washington fired first. Jumonville was killed in the attack along with several of his soldiers, and the French retaliated. Britain was not at war with France at this point, and this seemingly unprovoked attack was a diplomatic failure, followed by the disastrous Battle of Fort Necessity. Washington's reckless behavior ramped up the tensions between Britain and France and earned him a great deal of criticism as far away as London. In a way, though, Washington actually planted the seeds of future victory in the Revolutionary War that day. The French and Indian War would lead to the British levying heavy taxes on the new colonies to recoup the costs of the war, and this would foment the eventual revolution. But France's defeat by Britain in the French and Indian War would spur it to lend aid to the young American nation in order to weaken Britain, ensuring it won its freedom. Some of Washington's worst behavior came after the French and Indian War and the Revolutionary War, when Washington turned his military experience on the native tribes, some of whom fought side by side with him against the French. During his time in the French and Indian War, the Mingo leader Tanaquisson gave Washington the nickname Conotocarius, which translates to town taker, burner of towns, or town destroyer. The nickname was something of a family heirloom originally given to his great-grandfather John Washington after he participated in the massacre of 5 native chiefs in Virginia and Maryland. On May 31, 1779, during the Revolutionary War, Washington issued a command to General Sullivan. The expedition you are appointed to command is to be directed against the hostile tribes of the 6 nations of Indians. The immediate objects are the total destruction and devastation of their settlements and the capture of as many prisoners of every age and sex as possible. It will be essential to ruin their crops now on the ground and prevent their planting more. Parties should be detached to lay waste all settlements around, with instructions to do it in the most effectual manner, that the country may not be merely overrun, but destroyed. During the course of the Sullivan expedition, over 40 Iroquois villages were destroyed. In August 1789, Washington and his Secretary of War, Henry Knox, attempted to purchase native land via treaties. When they refused to sell, Washington threatened to extirpate them or destroy completely. By 1792, his reputation was solidified. Mohawk Chief Joseph Brant visited Washington in Philadelphia, then returned home and issued a warning. General Washington is very cunning. He will try to fool us if he can. He speaks very smooth, will tell you fair stories, and at the same time wants to ruin us. Also in the 1790s, a Seneca chief addressed this destruction wrought by Washington against the native people. When your army entered the country of the Six Nations, we called you the Town Destroyer, and to this day, when that name is heard, our women look behind them and turn pale, and our children cling close to the necks of their mothers. Washington's history of human rights violations didn't begin or end with his treatment of the indigenous people of North America either. Like most of America's founding fathers, George Washington participated in the institution of slavery. George Washington first became a slave owner at only 11 years old, when his father died and left him with the 280-acre family farm, along with 10 enslaved people. In young adulthood, Washington purchased 8 more enslaved people. Then in 1755, he purchased 4 men, 2 women, and a child. When he married Martha Custis, his slave holdings increased by a massive amount, with Martha bringing 84 enslaved workers to Mount Vernon. In the 16 years that followed, Washington purchased 40 more. Richard Parkinson, an Englishman who lived near the Washington estate of Mount Vernon, once commented on Washington's behavior as a slave owner. It was the sense of all his neighbors that he threatened them with more severity than any other man. During the Revolutionary War, Washington's attitudes on slavery appeared to change. He was exposed to parts of the country where agriculture was done without slave labor. He approved the enlistment of free black soldiers into the Continental Army, even though he had once opposed it. In 1786, he wrote about his desire to see a plan for abolition put into practice, saying, "I hope it will not be conceived from these observations that it is my wish to hold the unhappy people who are the subject of this letter in slavery. I can only say that there is not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of it. But there is only one proper and effectual mode by which it can be accomplished, and that is by legislative authority. And this, as far as my suffrage will go, shall never be wanting." So he must have spent the years that followed working to abolish slavery and didn't continue the institution anymore, right? Wrong. In spite of his words, Washington continued to use slave labor and even contributed to making life harder for escaped slaves. When he moved into the presidential home after he was elected, he and Martha brought enslaved workers with them to New York from Mount Vernon, separating them from their families. He may have claimed that his principles had changed, but his actions said something entirely different. In 1793, George Washington signed the Fugitive Slave Act into law. This act guaranteed the right for a slaveholder to recover an escaped slave and put enslaved people who escaped to freedom at risk of being recaptured and brought back into slavery for the rest of their lives. The act was written at the same time as a controversial case wherein a free black man named John Davis was kidnapped from Pennsylvania and taken to Virginia, forced into slavery. The act also made it a federal crime for anyone to assist a person escaping from slavery or to interfere with the escaped slave's capture. Washington had his own direct experience with fugitive slaves after one of his own escaped from his home, fleeing the bondage there for a life of freedom. In April of 1774, a baby girl named Ona Judge was born. Her mother, Betty, was a slave from the estate of Martha's first husband. Her father, Andrew Judge, was a white indentured servant who had traveled to America from Leeds, London. He worked at Mount Vernon for 4 years before moving away to start a farm of his own. In spite of her father's status as a free citizen, Ona was born into slavery, considered property of her mother slaveholder Martha Washington. Ona, also known by her nickname Oni, lived with Betty in a small cabin with her mother for the first 12 years of her life, helping her with whatever work she could. Then, when she was 12 years old, Martha moved her into the main house and began training her to be a housemaid. Then in 1789, Washington was elected president, and Martha brought Ona with her to the president's house in New York City. Ona was only 16, forced to leave her mother and siblings behind as one of only 9 enslaved people taken from Mount Vernon to the presidential estate. So with no choice in the matter, Ona went to New York and then to Philadelphia when the nation's capital moved there. In Philadelphia, Ona was exposed to a community of free black Americans for the first time in her life. In fact, in Philadelphia, there were more free black Americans than enslaved, with over 6,000 free black Americans compared to fewer than 100 enslaved people in the city limits. Pennsylvania had put a gradual abolition law into place in 1780, and in order to keep their enslaved workers from gaining legal residency there, they would take them in and out of the state every 6 months. But even though it was still out of reach, Ona was learning about the possibility of freedom and about the burgeoning abolitionist movement. Still, the possibility of self-emancipating and escaping came with potentially dire consequences. Washington was known for whipping those who disobeyed him, and the enslaved people who incurred his wrath enough or were caught trying to self-emancipate were sold to plantations in the Caribbean, where the working conditions were even more dangerous. There was also the Fugitive Slave Act to worry about, but Ona paid close attention, listening and learning from the formerly enslaved in Philadelphia, reminding her again and again of the possibility of a free life. In March of 1796, Martha's granddaughter, Eliza Custis, married Thomas Law. As a wedding present, Martha decided to give Ona to the newlywed couple, ripping Ona away from her life in Philadelphia and the possibility of returning to her family in Mount Vernon. Not only that, but Eliza was notoriously volatile, known for having anger issues and an unpredictable personality. It was now or never. In the spring of 1796, Ona contacted members of the free black community and began to plan her escape. On May 21, 1796, Ona managed to slip away. Many years later, she described her escape in a newspaper interview. "Whilst they were packing up to go to Virginia, I was packing to go. I didn't know where, for I knew that if I went back to Virginia, I should never get my liberty. I had friends among the colored people of Philadelphia, had my things carried there beforehand, and left Washington's house while they were eating dinner." 2 days after Ona's escape, Washington's steward, Frederick Kitt, placed an advertisement in the Philadelphia Gazette. The text of the ad reads as follows: "Absconded from the household of the President of the United States, Oni Judge. She is of middle stature, slender and delicately formed, about 20 years of age. She has many changes of good clothes of all sorts, but they are not sufficiently recollected to be described. As there was no suspicion of her going off, nor no provocation to do so, it is not easy to conjecture whither she has gone or fully what her design is. But as she may attempt to escape by water, all masters of vessels are cautioned against admitting her into them, although it is possible she will attempt to pass for a free woman, and has, it is said, wherewithal to pay her passage. $10 will be paid to any person who will bring her home, if taken in the city or on board any vessel in the harbor, and a reasonable additional sum if apprehended at and brought from a greater distance, and in proportion to the distance." Once she had left the Washington home, Ona made her way to a ship commanded by Captain John Bowles, who after 5 days at sea safely dropped her off in the city of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. There she found paid work as a domestic servant and began her new life, but she couldn't avoid detection for long. The summer after she escaped, Judge was spotted walking down the Portsmouth streets by Elizabeth Langdon, daughter of the New Hampshire Senator John Langdon. She recognized Ona from her time visiting Martha Washington, and before long, word of Ona's whereabouts had reached the president's house. George opted not to use the fugitive slave law he had himself signed, fearing the publicity it would generate if he took the case to the courts. Instead, he contacted Joseph Whipple, the Portsmouth Collector of Customs, who had earned that position through the help of the Washington administration. At Washington's behest, Whipple told his friends that he was looking to hire a maidservant to assist his wife. Ona heard about the job posting and met with Whipple about the details. However, she quickly realized that something was up, as his questions became too prying and personal. He admitted the ruse and asked her to consider returning to Washington. Ona agreed, but only to get away from him. He waited for her at the docks, preparing to ship her back to Virginia, but she never showed up. When Whipple informed Washington that he had been unable to collect Judge, Washington asked him to capture Ona by force and drag her onto a ship back to him. Uncomfortable, he refused. After Whipple's attempt to return her to Washington failed, Judge was able to relax for a time. In 1797, she married Jack Staines, a free black sailor. But even as she settled into her new married life, the fight for her freedom still wasn't over. Washington hadn't given up. In 1799, he asked his nephew, Burwell Bassett Jr., to use a business trip to New Hampshire as an excuse to apprehend Judge and any children she may have had. First, Bassett tried to simply use verbal persuasion to bring Ona back. Of course, she refused. He offered her the possibility of the Washingtons freeing her after she returned to Virginia, but she replied, "I am free now, and I choose to remain so." After his initial plan failed, Bassett regrouped at the home of Senator Langdon. There, he shared his next plan with the senator. He intended to use force to carry her back to Virginia. Sympathetic to Ona and her desire to remain free, Langdon secretly sent a message urging her to get out of town. She heeded the warning, fleeing to Greenland, New Hampshire, where she stayed hidden in the home of a man known as Mr. Jack. After this second attempt to recover her, George Washington never bothered Ona Judge again. He died shortly after, and the rest of his family left her alone. She had several children, became active in her local church community, spoke about her experiences in an abolitionist newspaper, and passed away on February 25, 1848 in Greenland, New Hampshire as a free woman. There are a lot of truths about George Washington that seldom get told. And then there are, quote, facts about him that are just plain wrong. You might be under the impression that George Washington had fake teeth made from wood. He did have dentures, that much is true. When he first entered office, he wore dentures made from brass, ivory, and gold, built by the dentist John Greenwood. There's also a distinct possibility that at some point he wore dentures constructed from human teeth, specifically constructed from the purchased teeth of enslaved people. On at least one occasion, Washington is confirmed to have purchased teeth from an unidentified enslaved person. Mount Vernon's plantation manager recorded this transaction in May of 1784, cash in exchange for 9 teeth. It's been debated whether or not these teeth were purchased for Washington's direct use or on behalf of French dentist Jean-Pierre Le Meilleur. But whatever the case might have been, Washington did buy them. A commonly repeated fact about George Washington is that he stipulated in his will that all of his enslaved workers would be freed on the occasion of his death. While that was indeed written into his will, what happened at Mount Vernon following Washington's death was a different story. See, the will also insisted that ownership of the enslaved workers would pass to Martha, who would own them for as long as she wanted. So he didn't actually free them at all, only passed them from one form of bondage to another. At the time of his death, Washington owned 123 enslaved people. Martha chose to free one of them, William Lee. The others remained enslaved, growing increasingly and understandably resentful of her. After a fire was set at Mount Vernon and rumors of a plan to poison her began to circulate, Martha eventually freed George's enslaved workers in January of 1801. Those owned by Martha weren't so lucky. After she died, they were left to her children. So, though it might have seemed like a noble gesture for Washington to free his enslaved workers in his will, it was little more than just that, a gesture, and an empty one. George Washington was a man of many contradictions. According to one story, a man staying at Mount Vernon once tried to sexually assault one of the enslaved women working in the house. At the sound of her scream, Washington burst from his bedroom and kicked the man down the stairs. However, at the same time, there was a rumor that he himself sexually abused the women working in his house. During the Revolutionary War, he banned his soldiers from playing cards, cursing, or bathing naked anywhere a civilian might see them. But he had no qualms about violence and killing, particularly when employed against the native tribes that stood in the way of the expansion of the U.S. His violence extended to his own troops, too. Deserters could receive up to 1,000 lashes, and 2 men court-martialed by the general were hanged from the gallows 40 feet in the air, serving as an example to the rest of the men. He fought for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He signed the Declaration of Independence, stating all men to be created equal, but stripped independence from countless men, women, and children. Like the United States of America itself, the legacy of George Washington is not simple, clean, or bloodless. When celebrating the results of his accomplishments and the nation he helped to build, it's important that we don't erase the evils that he was complicit in either. After all, if we can't learn from the wrongdoings of the great men of history, we will be doomed to repeat them. Now go check out US World War III plan, or click this other video instead.